Well, thank you, Margaret, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming today and giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And I wanted to just highlight one small change in my title. Climate change and its consequences for the oceans in 30 minutes or less. And this, what I really meant was just to stress the point that this is a really big topic, and there's no way I can really do any of it justice, any piece of it justice in a 30-minute talk. So what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time just talking generally about what climate change is and what we expect to change, and then give you some examples of changes that we're already seeing occurring in the ocean. And then at the end, I'll talk briefly a little bit about my research in Washington, which Margaret and a couple other Scripps students have been a part of. But I actually wanted to start with a quiz. When I started putting this talk together a couple weeks ago, a group at Yale called the Project on Climate Change Communication released a report where they surveyed Americans on their knowledge of climate change. And what they found was somewhat distressing in that they judged that only about 8% of Americans have a satisfactory understanding of what climate change is and how it works. So I thought in giving you a background on climate change, I would actually, instead of just giving a lecture, let you test your knowledge. So I picked 3 questions off of this survey, and I'm going to have you guys compare your answers, see how you do compared to the pool of Americans that they did in the survey. So here's your first question, which is what is the state of what scientists think about climate change? So I'll just do this quickly by a show of hands. How many of you would agree with the first statement that most scientists think climate change, global warming is happening? Okay, how many of you would agree with the second statement that most scientists think global warming is not happening? Okay, how about the third statement? There's a lot of disagreement among scientists about global warming. Okay, and there's always on these questions an I don't know option. Does anybody want to choose the I don't know? Okay, good. Well, if you answered the first statement, you're right, but unfortunately, you're among the minority of Americans who realize that most scientists do think global warming is happening. So let me just explain why it is that we think global warming is happening. And that's mainly because of the exhaustive amount of evidence that we're seeing changes in the Earth and changes in the ecology or the organisms that live on the Earth that are consistent with climate change. And to explain the information on this slide, I need to back up and tell you a little bit about the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is a chartered organization of the United Nations whose job it is just to keep up with the literature on climate change. So they read everything that's published about climate change, about organisms that are being affected by climate change. And roughly every 5 years, they put out a report saying, this is the status of our knowledge about climate change. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's what we think is going to happen in the future. Their most recent report came out in 2007. And for that report, they looked at over 29,000 separate observations made by scientists. And these were, peer-reviewed, statistically significant, solid observations, of which 90% of which were consistent with the idea of a warming climate. So these are things like how early each spring does snow melt in New York City? How fast are glaciers shrinking, or are they growing in different parts of the world? How early each spring are flowers blooming in your backyard? Are they blooming a little bit earlier every year or not? And how early in the spring are birds starting their migrations? So this sort of information, and I should say some of my own research is part of this 29,436 observations, is what's giving us confidence that we really do see a warming climate. Okay, so that was question 1. Oh, okay, so the other thing that scientists are fairly confident about is that warming climate is caused by human activity. So presumably you've all heard of the greenhouse effect before. I just wanted to go over this very quickly. But basically, greenhouse gases are molecules in the atmosphere that function in the same way as the panes of glass on a greenhouse. They let energy into the Earth from the sun in the form of light, but when the sun heats up and radiates that energy back out, those molecules hold on to some of that energy and send it back to Earth. Okay, and there's a bunch of different molecules that do this, and overall the greenhouse effect is a good thing. If we didn't have any greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere, this would be a very cold place and none of us would be here today. But human activities, mainly through the burning of fossil fuels, are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that, we're pretty certain, is what's causing the warming temperatures and those 29,000 changes I talked about. All right, so here's your next question, and this should be easier. This is true or false. If we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, global warming would stop almost immediately. How many of you think that's true? Wow, how many of you think that's false? Okay, I'm impressed. You did much better than the people they surveyed. Only 25% of people correctly identified that that statement is definitely false. And that's because carbon dioxide that we put up into the atmosphere stays up there for hundreds to thousands of years. Okay, here's the last of the questions I chose off this survey. How much carbon dioxide is actually up in the atmosphere? And relative to, so 1850 was about the start of the Industrial Revolution. So how much do you think was up there back then in the 1850s? Today there's obviously more, but let's just look at 1850. So how many of you would say there's 150 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1850? In 1850 there was. How about 290? 350? 390? 450? Okay. Those of you who said 290, you were correct. There were roughly 290 parts per million before the start of the Industrial Revolution, and now there's roughly 390 parts per million. Those of you who said anything else were with the majority of Americans who just don't have any idea. So this is where it gets a little bit depressing, because climate, at least for me, because climate change is a really important issue. But in order to be able to understand what we need to do about it, the American public has to know at least enough about what's going on to be able to separate fact from fiction. And so more than 3/4 of the people they surveyed didn't even want to hazard a guess as to how much carbon dioxide is up in the atmosphere, either in 1850 or today. So this figure, you probably have seen something like this at some other point in your life. This just shows, for the past 400,000 years, concentrations of carbon dioxide going up and down in the atmosphere and global temperature going up and down. And that nice correlation is part of the reason that we think that greenhouse gases, the increase in greenhouse gases, is causing the warming. But it's worth pointing out that it's more than just correlation. So as a counterexample, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this website, but this is a guy who believes that global warming is caused by a lack of pirates. So his argument is, if you go back to the 1850s, when there were 35 to 45,000 pirates, the climate was nice and cool. But by 2000, we were down to 17, and that's when things really began to warm up. So it's a very silly example, but my point is that just because you can draw a correlation between two things, like carbon dioxide and temperature, doesn't necessarily mean that that is carbon dioxide that's causing temperature. However, in this case, we have lots and lots and lots of really smart physicists and chemists who do understand a mechanism. We have a mechanism by which carbon dioxide absorbs heat in the atmosphere. This has been described for at least 50 years. It's well established, and we really know that this is what's going on. Okay, so now switching gears. That was your quick introduction to climate change, to talk about what climate change is doing to the ocean. So first we have to talk about how much the climate is going to change. And to do that, I want to talk really quickly about how scientists make predictions about climate change. And these are using what's called global climate models, or GCMs. So these are very, very large, complicated computer models. And there are roughly a dozen different research groups scattered around the world that are working on and developing these models. This particular image that's supposed to give you an idea of what goes into a climate model, I took from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado, which is one of the groups in the US that has developed one of these models. And so in order to get climate right, they have to model everything from what kinds of clouds you have in the atmosphere and how high they are, to how much volcanic eruptions there were on any given day or any given year. This is a very large model. It's so complex that, according to their website, it requires 3 trillion computer calculations just to get a single day of climate predicted. Okay, so that's, but that's really only half the story. The other half of the story is how much carbon dioxide we're going to put up into the atmosphere over the next century. And that depends on understanding something about humans. How much is human population going to grow? How quickly are new technologies going to arise? how much our country's going to work together, and those technologies going to be transferred between countries. So the physics and the chemistry up here, but this down here is economics, political science, sociology, anthropology. One of the other things that the IPCC does is actually work with these groups of academics and scientists to try and develop different scenarios for how basically the Earth is going to develop in terms of things like population growth and cooperation among nations to build a range of predictions that then those modelers can take and put into those very complicated models. So that's why when you look at predictions like these are sort of the 4 major predictions for how climate change is going to affect the ocean. Everything's always given in a range. So ocean temperatures are expected to warm up by anywhere from, excuse me, by anywhere from 1.5 to 2.6 degrees. 1.5 is if we all get along and do all the right things really quick, and 2.6 is if we don't. So what I want to do, so very briefly, so we expect a rise in ocean temperature under climate change, and we've already seen some of that. We expect an increase in sea level, and this actually may be underestimated according to some of the models that have come out since 2007. We expect a change in the pH of the oceans because the ocean is actually absorbing some of the carbon dioxide that we're sending into the atmosphere, and I'll talk about this. And we also probably expect to see changes in the size and the frequency of waves and the frequency of storms. Those things are much more local phenomena, and it's very hard to predict exactly how and where those will change, but they are clearly as important as some of these other things. So what I wanted to do in the rest of the talk is just briefly give you some examples of where we see organisms responding to these changes. And so let's start with temperature. The first thing is that we are already seeing shifts of species in terms of where they occur in the oceans based on these changes in temperature. So this is one example from a study that came out in 2005 that looked at fish in the North Sea. So here's England up here, the coast of France and Germany, and Scandinavia over there. And so they looked at catches of fish from the 1970s to 2000, and what they found was 2/3 of the fish species that they looked at had shifted their distribution so that they were now being caught farther north than they used to be or deeper in the ocean than they used to be. And both of those shifts, either moving north or moving deeper, is consistent with the idea of getting away from warmer water, right, into cooler environments. So that's one example out in the open ocean. Here's another example looking at coastal species. And that figure looks a lot better on my computer. But this is actually something that started as a class project when I was an undergraduate in college and happened to wind up getting published in Science, which was pretty cool at the time. What we did was, I don't know if you can make this out, but this is a little piece of shore in Monterey Bay. And it's the same piece of shore shown 60 years apart. And so as a class project, we went out and resurveyed this shore that somebody had written down all the organisms that occurred on that little stretch of shore in the 30s. And what we found was this really clear and really simple pattern when we looked at which species were changing based on where they occurred. So species that were predominantly found south of Monterey Bay were the ones that did most of the increasing, whereas colder water species from the north actually declined in this 60-year period. So this, again, is consistent with the idea that species are moving to the north along the coast as the water temperatures around Monterey Bay warm up. And we did see in that 60-year period about a 2°C increase in summer water temperatures. And I should point out, these are coastal species. So these are things like crabs and snails and mussels and all these things that you would see in a tide pool if you went down to the beach. Okay, so in some ways, these two are examples of success stories because everything's shifting a little bit further north or a little bit deeper. Nothing's going extinct. There are other species that are not going to be so lucky, we think. And so coral reefs are likely to be some of the hardest hit organisms by climate change. And this slide shows 1998 was the first year that we had basically a worldwide synchronized coral bleaching event. That was associated with the El Nino weather pattern in that year. So very briefly, this is a photo of coral bleaching, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but down here are happy, healthy polyps of the coral, and these guys are all white. because they've bleached out and died. So for those of you who aren't familiar with coral, coral is actually a symbiosis between an animal that looks kind of like an anemone and an algae, a unicellular algae that lives inside that animal. And under certain circumstances, mainly when water temperatures get warm, but also in relation to change in pH or associated with some diseases, those algae will leave the coral. And it's not really clear if the algae are getting up and leaving or the coral is actually kicking them out. But because the coral animal depends on those algae for energy and food, they tend not to do very well without them. So in some cases, a coral that's bleached because of warm temperatures will recover algae, unicellular algae will recolonize it and it will be healthy, but as much as 50% of the time, the coral will actually die following bleaching. What was I going to say? And corals can't move the way a fish can. So tropical habitats in general, because they're already pretty hot and they're definitely going to get warmer, and coral reefs in particular, because they're stuck in one place and often even their larvae don't swim very far, are thought to be some of the most sensitive to climate change. So that's a brief snapshot of temperature in the oceans. We can talk a little bit about sea level rise. So this is a picture of Venice from 2008, when basically the highest tide of the year happened to co-occur with a pretty big storm. And as sea level rise, you can expect to see more of this. So there are clearly economic issues to humans associated with sea level rise. Half of all Americans live at or near the coast, within an hour of the coast, basically. So these kinds of freak events associated with flooding are going to become more common worldwide. As far as what sea level rise does to marine organisms, if you're a fish living out in the middle of the ocean, you probably don't care all that much. But if you live on the edge of the shore, which is where I study, what's called the intertidal, that region that's actually exposed to air at low tide but underwater at high tide, sea level rise can be a pretty big problem. Ideally, as sea level rises, that whole intertidal zone should just shift up the shore with the water level changing. Unfortunately, a lot of times that's not going to happen because of human activity. So what you're looking at in this slide, this is part, I think, of the South Carolina coast. And you can make out just about here, this is low tide. This is a little bit of an intertidal mudflat. So this little patch of mud, which is probably kind of stinky and not all that aesthetically interesting, is full of all kinds of worms and clams that really like living in this stretch of coast. Just behind this intertidal is a big rock jetty and a park and a bunch of buildings. And so probably at some point this mudflat extended much farther inland, but somebody decided to build a jetty, fill it in with dirt, and put up a bunch of buildings. And so you can imagine as sea level rises, rather than letting all this move back in towards shore, the jetty is going to get taller to protect the buildings and the economic investment of people who live and work in there. And that's important. But what that may mean is that we'll lose this little intertidal mudflat. It'll become submerged. And although that may not seem like a big deal, there's a different set of species living down here that like to be submerged 24 hours a day that'll move in and displace the intertidal ones. So we're talking about losing coastal habitats at quite an alarming rate, in part because there are just so many humans and so many human activities that are right on the coast that have modified coastal environments. So that's sort of important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that lots of tasty things that we like to eat depend on those coastal habitats for completing their life cycle. So you are probably familiar with salmon that migrate upstream to reproduce and spawn and then swim back out. If you like crab, or if you like, there's some other fish that have juvenile or larval stages that depend on living in estuaries or freshwater environments at the edge of the sea and depend on having other organisms living in those habitats that they can feed on. So if we lose this habitat, because estuaries are also nice places to put bays and harbors and resort hotels, and those things have to be protected from sea level rise for lots of obvious reasons, we risk losing whole fish populations and populations of other organisms that also need those habitats. Okay, so we've done temperature and sea level rise. And here, this is cut off a little bit, but this is ocean acidification. This is probably the one that scientists know the least about, but is possibly the scariest. So ocean acidification occurs because as carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, some of it is also absorbed by the oceans. And that's generally a good thing if you're thinking about global warming, because if it's in the ocean, it can't be having a greenhouse effect in the atmosphere. But when it gets into the oceans, it actually reacts with the water molecules in the ocean and changes the pH of the ocean, makes it slightly more acidic. And that little change in acidity can affect the ability of organisms to build shells. So what you're looking at is sort of a map of the ocean today, or in 1994, and projected in 2100. And the difference between the red and the green is basically how easy it is to build a shell. So in these red areas, it's hard for organisms like corals and snails and mussels to put a shell together. In the green, it's a pretty easy thing to do. So as we put more carbon dioxide into the ocean, that boundary between happy and unhappy is going to rise up towards the surface, particularly in the southern hemisphere, and making it much harder for organisms, a lot of organisms, to go about their daily business. A couple examples I just pulled up from the literature. Excuse me. So here's one study. I think these are quite beautiful. These are called coccolithophores. These are a unicellular algae-like thing that lives in the surface waters of the ocean, photosynthesizes. These guys were all grown at seawater with normal amounts of carbon dioxide in them. These guys down here were grown at seawater with a doubling of carbon dioxide. And so you can see they go from happy to not so happy. So if these guys don't function, that's bad news for things that need to eat them, which is ultimately pretty much everything in the ocean depends on some kind of a photosynthesizer at the base of their food chain. Here's another example, and this is a little dark, but I hope you can make it out. This is a brittle star, so a sea star that lives on the coast of Scandinavia. And this one, they grew its larvae at the normal pH of seawater over here, and at a slightly acidified pH, so going from 8.1 to 7.9. 7.9 they picked because that's predicted to be the ocean pH in that area by 2050. So this guy's happy. This guy is not going to live long enough to turn into an adult. So this is probably not the cheerful, happy talk you guys were expecting. But so up to now, I've talked mainly about other people's research and about sort of direct effects of things like temperature and sea level on organisms. The piece that I've been working on in Washington that Margaret and other students have been helping me with is looking at interactions between species and how that changes your prediction. So I've been looking mainly at effects of temperature on a suite of species, two of which here are predatory snails, Nucella lamellosa and Nucella ostrida, that feed on a bunch of different barnacles. If you've never heard of a barnacle, I like to tell my marine ecology students it's a very confused shrimp. It starts out as a little larva that looks quite a bit like a shrimp. When it's ready to settle down and become an adult, it lands on shore, glues its head to the rock, sticks its legs into the air and starts feeding, and pretty much dissolves anything that might have been considered a brain. So these just sit on the rock in one place as adults, although as larvae, they look very similar to things like crabs and shrimp. So the question I've been interested in is how does these interactions between these species, in one case competition between species for space, or predation, the act of one species feeding on each other, change how temperature and warming temperatures affect the organism. And I'm just going to give you a very quick example of this. So one of the things I've looked at is how temperature affects the feeding and foraging behavior of the snails. So these guys are like some other species I've mentioned, they're intertidal. So at low tide, they're out exposed to the air, sitting on rocks. But barnacles, because they're stuck in one place, they're just stuck on that rock. And when the tide goes out, they just have to deal with whatever temperature it is. The snails have a choice. They can be out exposed where they can have lots of barnacles to feed on, or they could go hide somewhere and avoid that heat stress. So I've been trying to figure out whether on warmer, more stressful days, the snails would all rather hide out, or whether warmer temperatures might actually ramp up their metabolism, make them feed more so that they have energy to deal with the stress of that warmer temperature. To get at that, I did a pretty simple experiment where I took snails, you can see that down here, and change the temperature that they would experience at low tide when they're out in the sun. And so I took a jar of brown nail polish, and the snails are normally white, and I painted half of them brown. So pretty straightforward. Darker colored shells are going to heat up more in the sun. I did this experiment in what's called a mesocosm. So this is sort of halfway between doing it naturally in the field and doing it indoors in the lab. These are a bunch of tanks that are out, out on the coast just above the water levels, actually down here. And you can't see it in this picture, but they're connected to a bunch of pumps and timers. So I can regulate the water level in the tank and create that daily high tide and low tide that they would normally experience in the field. So I had 3 treatments in this experiment. Unpainted snails, the painted snails, which you can see got a lot warmer, and then I had another kind of control where I painted the snails with the brown nail polish, but then I shaded them so that I could distinguish whether if these darker snails did something different, it was because they were getting warmer temperatures or because they were all freaked out because somebody had painted their shells brown, right? So I had 2 different kinds of controls in this experiment, but I'll save you the messiness of the data and just tell you my conclusion here was what the snails did was avoid the heat stress. When you painted them brown, they foraged a lot less often and they ate a lot less. And in some cases, they actually died from that because they weren't getting enough energy. So what that means is that if you want to say, well, are warming temperatures good or bad for a barnacle or a snail or a whale or a seal or whatever, you have to look at it in the context of its community. The barnacles who are sitting on that rock are going to get hot no matter what, but they might actually have a little benefit of less predation. And whether those are going to cancel each other out or not is not something I can say. The snails, on the other hand, are getting a double whammy. So they have less opportunity to feed, but they're still going to be exposed to some of that heat stress, no matter how hard they hide. And really the last thought I want to leave you with, and this is, I don't know if you can make this slide out very well at all, but this is an ecosystem, a schematic of an ecosystem that somebody did for the Alaskan coastline. But species and communities are these very complex things that interact both with each other, with abiotic factors, and with human activities. And I suspect there are a lot more surprises out there in terms of how climate change is going to affect these organisms and what it's going to do to them than there are things that scientists can actually know and predict and tell you today for certain is what's going to happen. So I'll stop there and I'll thank you guys for coming and take any questions.